Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at the journey of Omer Bartov. He's a really well-known historian, but he's also a former Israeli soldier. And after a trip back to Israel in the summer of 2024, he came away with this incredibly powerful and frankly deeply disturbing analysis of a country he feels he hardly recognizes anymore.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's June 2024. Bartov is at Ben-Gurion University, scheduled to give a pretty standard academic lecture about the war in Gaza. But when he arrives, he doesn't find a room full of curious students. Instead, he walks right into an aggressive protest aimed squarely at him.
And this is the message that went flying around on WhatsApp to get people there. The charge against him? Betrayal. See, they were pointing to his critical writings, like an article in the New York Times where he warned about the potential for genocide, and they were using it as proof that he was an enemy of the state. Now, these weren't just random protesters. As Bartov soon learned, many were students who had just gotten back from fighting in Gaza. For a solid hour, they're shouting, banging on the walls. And then Bartov does something most people wouldn't do. He invites them in, not to yell, but to talk. And as he sat there and listened to them for the next 2 hours, he had this sinking realization. Their views, as extreme as they sounded, weren't friend at all. They were a reflection of something much, much bigger happening in the country.
So to really get where Bartov is coming from with all this, you have to understand the man himself. You know, his entire viewpoint is shaped by these two very different and, you could say, sometimes conflicting sides of his own life. And when you lay it out like this, you can really see that tension. On one hand, you have the soldier. This is a guy who spent 4 years in the IDF, commanded a company in the absolute hell of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and patrolled the streets of Gaza as an occupier. He saw it all firsthand. But on the other hand, you've got the historian, an Oxford PhD, a world-renowned expert on the Holocaust, and specifically how the German army was indoctrinated during World War II. This dual identity gives him a kind of authority on wars, soldiers, and atrocity that's pretty hard to ignore. And this is where things get really chilling. It's where Bartov's two identities, the soldier and the historian, slam into each other. He started to hear things, language being used in Israel today, that felt disturbingly familiar to what he'd spent decades studying from Nazi Germany. Okay, so a huge part of Bartov's life's work as a historian boils down to this one crucial idea: to get ordinary German soldiers to commit the unbelievable atrocities they did on the Eastern Front, you had to prepare them psychologically first. You had to indoctrinate them into seeing their enemies, Slavs, Bolsheviks, Jews, as subhuman. That dehumanization, he argues, was the essential first step before mass violence could happen. Now, let's jump to October 2023. This is Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, speaking right after the Hamas attack. That phrase, human animals. For Bartov, hearing that, it must have sent a shiver down his spine. It was a direct, unmistakable echo of the very language he had built his career studying. And get this. This is the historical parallel from his own research that just stopped him in his tracks. It's from a German army leaflet in 1941. The structure is eerily similar. This idea that calling the enemy an animal is actually an insult to animals. For Bartov, this wasn't just a coincidence. This was a pattern, a deeply alarming one. And for Bartov, this wasn't just some one-off comment. He points to what he sees as a clear and consistent pattern of this kind of rhetoric, coming from the very top of Israel's leadership. From invoking the biblical command to destroy Amalek, which means men, women, and children, to calls for total annihilation, and to literally erase the Gaza Strip. In his view, this kind of language from officials created a green light, a permissive environment for the massive destruction that came next. So you have to ask, how does a country get to this place? Bartov says you can't understand the present without digging into the past, into Israel's own history and the foundational stories it tells about itself. He zeroes in on this really pivotal moment in 1956. It involves a famous speech by the Israeli military hero Moshe Dayan. At a funeral, he gives this incredible eulogy where he actually acknowledges Palestinian pain. He says, "Look, we can't blame them for hating us when we've taken the land their ancestors lived on." It's an amazing moment of empathy. But then, the very next day, when the speech is recorded for the radio, That part is just gone, edited out. The version that became iconic, the one that every Israeli kid learned, is a simple, brutal message. We are under siege, and if we ever drop our sword, we die. The empathy was removed, and only the sword remained.
And then there's this other layer Bartov points to, something he calls the Samson complex. You know the story. Samson, the biblical hero, blinded and humiliated by the Philistines, in, of all places, Gaza. And what does he do? He uses his last bit of strength to pull the temple down, killing everyone, including himself. Bartov argues this dark tale of suicidal mass revenge runs deep in the Israeli psyche.
So when you put all of this together, the angry protesters, the dehumanizing language, the historical context, it all leads to the real gut punch of Bartov's journey. It leads to his own personal and professional change of heart.
Just look at how much his position shifted. Back in November 2023, he was very clear. He said, as a historian of genocide, he doesn't see proof that it's currently happening, but that we're on a dangerous path. But fast forward to the summer of 2024, after months of war and the assault on Rafah, and he says, I no longer hold this view. He now argues it's impossible to deny that Israel is committing genocidal acts. I mean, for a scholar of his standing to make that kind of public reversal, it's a huge, incredibly difficult step to take. So what was the final straw? What changed his mind? For Bartov, the turning point was when the actions on the ground, especially what happened in Rafah, seemed to perfectly match the chilling rhetoric from months before. He came to the conclusion that the systematic destruction wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was designed to make Gaza fundamentally unlivable. And in his professional judgment as a scholar, that crosses a very specific legal line. It matches the UN definition of a genocidal act, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about deride, physical destruction. And so this is the final haunting question that Bartov leaves us all with. Is it possible for the nation he was born in, the one he fought for, to pull itself out of what he sees as this cycle of violence? Can it ever get back to those ideals of freedom, justice, and peace that are right there in its own Declaration of Independence? It's just a heavy, heavy question hanging over a nation that he describes as traumatized, furious, and standing at a terrifying crossroads.